Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. After the University of Minnesota Board of Regents' April 26th decision not to unname buildings on the U of M campus, we're going back to school this week with U of M professor Riv-Ellen Prell, the creator of the exhibit A Campus Divided, and one of the foremost academics on the racism and anti-Semitism on the campus in the 1920s. The professor gives us the background on her exhibit, her thoughts on the Regents' decision, and what may come next in this debate on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Professor Riv-Ellen Prell, thank you so much for joining us this week on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, a lot of people know your name because you were the curator of the Campus Divided exhibit that was at the University of Minnesota. Is that the right curator? Is that the right way to phrase it?
So I was a co-curator of the exhibit.
Okay.
But the exhibit was my idea, and I put together a team who worked with me of graduate students, most centrally Sarah Atwood, a PhD student in American Studies, and Patrick Wiltz, a PhD student in history. And here's the story of how I became interested in this topic. A longtime member of the history department at the University of Minnesota and a kind of media figure was a man named Hy Berman, who died a few years ago. Trained actually as a Jewish historian, became a labor historian. And for the bicentennial, which was in 1976, he wrote an article that appeared in a journal called Jewish Social Studies. And it was on what some people might consider a somewhat obscure topic, but actually a profound topic. It was about the 1938 gubernatorial race in the state of Minnesota between a farmer labor sitting governor named Elmer Benson and a Republican candidate who won named Harold Stassen, who used to be well known because he ran for the presidency every 4 years. He was a kind of Minnesota figure. That race was driven by anti-Semitism. And Professor Berman wrote an article about what he called political anti-Semitism. And farmer labor was a very progressive party that dominated Minnesota politics in the 1930s. It became, after the war, known as the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is why our Democratic Party is called the DFL. They merged. But in that era, it was farmer labor. And Benson, as well as the first farmer labor governor, Governor Olson, had a number of Jewish advisors. And those advisors were used to suggest that these men were under the influence of Jews, and that these Jews were communists, and that they were exercising undue influence on Minnesota politics. And though Harold Stassen was quite a moderate in many ways, not literally until the morning of his election did he disavow the anti-Semitic mudslinging that was happening in that election. To give you a feeling for how traumatic that anti-Semitism was, it led to the founding of what today we call the JCRC. The Jews of Minnesota, the leaders of Minnesota, began to be really concerned about that level of public anti-Semitism. Benson lost. Farmer labor never regained control, in part because all of their great ideas became part of what we call the New Deal. And in those days, Republican moderates embraced a great deal of the New Deal, not some of its politics, but others. So in writing about this, I'm telling you a long story, in writing about this, he mentioned, Hy Berman, that the man behind this smear campaign was a man named Ray Chase. And Ray Chase had a close connection to Edward Nicholson. Edward Nicholson was the Dean of Student Affairs in the 30s. And based on Berman's research, he found that Nicholson had passed to Chase the name of many students at the University of Minnesota who appeared in the central anti-Semitic smear which was a publication called Are They Communists or Cat's Paws? Cat's Paws are today what we would call dupes.
Okay.
And so suggesting that these people like Benson and Floyd Olson had been dupes of anti-Semites, of Jews, rather.
Okay.
So he had voluminous citations from the Minnesota Historical Society where Ray Chase's papers are. So why was this of particularly compelling interest to me? Because the Center for Jewish Studies is housed in Nicholson Hall. Because I taught classes in Nicholson Hall. 3 days a week at a minimum, I was in Nicholson Hall, knowing for years and years who Edward Nicholson was. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting just to have a marker in Nicholson Hall that would identify who he was and what he did? And so I decided to retire about a year early, in 2016, to begin to do the research for this project, which is when I hired a graduate research assistant with research funding that I had to finally go to the Minnesota Historical Society and look at all the records in the footnotes of Hy Berman's article on political anti-Semitism. And after that work was done, Sarah Atwood said, it's time to go look at the archive of the University of Minnesota. So the University of Minnesota has archives of all kinds of things, but it also includes an archive of the University of Minnesota. And in that archive, there are the president's papers of every president of the University of Minnesota. And we learned that President Kaufman, in his archives, had folders that were labeled Negroes and folders that were labeled Jews. And these folders were not about the great stuff that Negroes, so-called Negroes and Jews, were doing in the 1930s. These were folders and papers devoted to all the ways that Negroes and Jews were making the life of President Kaufman difficult. And in looking at these folders, we learned that from 1930 all the way till 1942 and probably beyond, the university had created segregated, taxpayer-funded housing that African Americans were protesting. And what we had learned and what we were interested in was surveillance and how the names of University of Minnesota students ended up in the files of one of the most notorious anti-Semites in the state of Minnesota, Ray Chase. But what we also learned was simultaneously, in the 1930s, there were two major student movements. The largest movement was an anti-war movement, and this was not about the war in Vietnam. This was about the United States entering World War II. And the second, much smaller movement, but it would grow by the early 1940s, was a student movement to stop segregated housing and to improve the lives of African American students on campus, culminating in 1937 in the creation of what was called the Negro Student Council. There was small overlap between these movements. They were, for the most part, independent. But where there was an overlap between the movement for student rights and the movement for African American rights, the white students involved in that movement were overwhelmingly Jewish. And similarly, there were a small number of African American students who were involved in the struggle against the United States entering World War II. Now, of course, we read this and say, that was a good war. Why were there so many Jewish students protesting the possibility of the United States fighting against Nazism? And what one had to understand, what I myself had to do research about to understand, was that World War I was such a devastating war, particularly in Europe, but in the United States, on the lives of young people, that they did not want...
They don't want to repeat.
They didn't want to repeat.
Yeah.
They viewed World War I as a war that just destroyed young lives, So that even after, for example, they knew an armistice was coming, they still put young men into battle. So it was a much too complex for us to talk about today. But the student activists who I learned so much about all ultimately enlisted, and most became officers, with the exception of one person who was a conscientious objector. He wasn't Jewish, but he was a conscientious objector. So that nationwide student movement, in fact, the first student movement in the United States that began in the early 30s, was an anti-war movement. And there was, the University of Minnesota was one of the major campuses that had large demonstrations. And we learned that the administration was spying on those students, that there were documents that showed that an assistant to President Kaufman named Malcolm Willey wrote the president a memo saying he'd met at that point with the editor of the Minnesota Daily, who promised that the demonstrations would be covered on the back pages. And so the administration wouldn't allow the students to go into Northrop for their rally because they were calling for a strike that meant students should miss a class for an hour. So the Governor Olson, was on campus with the students, and President Kaufman was sitting in his office looking down on the governor of the state, rallying with students. They did bring police sometimes. So there was a one cannot overstate what an exciting activist moment that was, with many Jewish students involved. And given the extreme social separation on the campus of the time between Jewish and non-Jewish students, and the prejudices against Jewish students, keeping them out of fraternities, even keeping them out of pre-professional organizations. Like Jewish students had to have their own pharmacy organization, their own pre-med organization. Even at that level, there was absolute social segregation between Jewish students and non-Jewish students. Not in the anti-war movement, and not by the mid-1930s at the Minnesota Daily, which was an island of integration between Jews and non-Jews, but not African Americans until later in the 30s.
It sounds like the anti-Semitism and the anti-African American racism that was taking place, it sounds like it was running at that time fairly parallel to what Minneapolis as a city was like too.
Yes, that's an excellent point, because in 1931, the first African-American student, John Pinkett, attempts to move into Pioneer Hall, which is a brand new men's dormitory. He comes from Washington, D.C. He walks in the door. The president is immediately called. The records in Negro, Negro folders, are somewhat ambiguous. President Kaufman insists that John Pinkett Jr. Is wise, and when given the chance to leave, leaves immediately to live elsewhere. John Pinkett's father, John Pinkett Sr., writes a letter of outrage to President Kaufman about the fact that his son was removed. So President Kaufman claims that he is happy to leave. His father claims that's not what happened. And I tell you this because in the exact same year, an African-American family attempts to move into a home in South Minneapolis where there are riots. Their dog is killed. After 2 years, they finally relent and leave. The effort was always first to buy out African-American families who attempt to move into neighborhoods, and then there are riots. And this recent superb documentary that appeared on public radio about covenants that existed and what happened when African Americans tried to buy homes and move into white neighborhoods directly parallels what is happening with African American student housing on the campus of the University of Minnesota.
So one of the things that the Campus Divided exhibit helped spark after its run was the idea that the there were 4 campus buildings that were called out in particular in a recent task force, that they were named for the aforementioned President Kaufman, Dean Nicholson, or 2 other buildings.
President Coffey.
Okay.
And comptroller, the man who was in charge of financing, who became a vice president, Vice President Middlebrook.
That the buildings with their names should be renamed. There was a Board of Regents meeting as we're recording this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Before we talk about this. So, we did this research.
Yes.
And where the project began, in my mind, changed. That's what's a good thing about research.
Yes, that happens
by
with
what
research.
we discovered. The exhibit opened in August at Anderson Hall, which is where the archives of the University of Minnesota are. The estimation is that over 2,000 people viewed the exhibit. It was extended for a month. A smaller version of it appeared. Because it was a work of public history, we wanted to give people an opportunity to respond to what they saw in the exhibit. And by the time the exhibit closed, 560 people had written on stickies of many colors and left them up on the exhibit. All of them have been archived, and anybody can now view all of those. So that's where the exhibit ended. It was a work of public history. It opened many conversations. But the call for unnaming those 4 buildings and renaming them was part of a student movement that, of course, paralleled the movement I wanted described in the 30s, so that students could see for themselves, that students could completely transform a university. The fact that integrated housing happened on the campus was because of a student movement that was a movement of allies with people off campus, the Black Press, the NAACP. It was a lesson in politics and how we bring about change. And the Minnesota Student Association took up that lesson brilliantly. They created alliances with 15 organizations on campus. 1,200 students signed petitions calling for this. They went to the president and said, "We want you to unname and rename these buildings." So there's a difference between a work of public history, but what it inspired was a student movement.
Okay.
And it was that student movement that motivated the president to appoint 2 task forces for him to give partial support for this act, and the Regents defeated that student movement and its demands last Friday when the Regents meeting took place.
Were you surprised by the direction that the Regents went at their meeting last week?
So, I would say that the pretty early on, meaning in the last 2 months, at the first Regents meeting where this was taken up in March, it became immediately evident that there was little support for the unnaming of the buildings. Only Regent Abdul Omari, who first held a position as a student regent, did his PhD at the University of Minnesota, was an outspoken supporter for the unnaming. And they called it the unnaming because that's what the Regents were being called upon to do, was to simply open the possibility of unnaming the buildings. What I was unprepared for at the March meeting was that 2 regents attacked the integrity of the faculty who were appointed by President Kaler and Provost Hansen to look into let me restate this. What I was surprised about was the 2 regents who attacked the integrity and veracity of the task force report and claimed that it was full of distortions. These two men have never been willing to put in writing systematically what their objections were so that those objections could be answered. By this meeting last week, my work was attacked. And one of the attacks that was fascinating was that one of the regents claimed that he could find no evidence of the existence of the JCRC, that Samuel L. Shiner, who headed it had different names, but who headed it from 1938 in the story that I told you about until his retirement in the 1970s, that he could find no proof he existed. You understand that for the Jewish community, this was comparable to saying, I can't find any proof of the NAACP, and who were the leaders? I've never heard of them. So the extent of the distortion really has surprised me. Yeah. And they and a third regent at the most recent meeting are making greater claims that Lotus Kaufman and President Coffey were friends of African Americans who did more for African Americans than anyone had done previously. So I'm not surprised that they didn't vote it. That was something that's happening very widely throughout the United States. How can we be surprised when this happens simultaneous with the state Senate cutting the Minnesota Historical Society's budget by 15% simply because they used the indigenous name of the area where Fort Snelling is? Right. We all know that names matter, and we all know that history matters. And now in the state of Minnesota, we are in a fight for, yet again, telling a true history of the state of Minnesota, the things that were progressive about this state in some ways and the things that were not.
I thought it was really interesting in watching the meeting last Friday was the idea that Kaufman's name should stay on the union because he created the General College, which even though it's no longer in existence, he created the General College, and Norman Borlaug went to General College and then went on to win a Nobel, and that seems like a really strange connecting of dots. I don't know how you felt sitting there watching that, but that felt like a really weird path.
Well, here's what I think is really important about this. First of all, there are no one, me included, my research team, the task force in particular, if you would read their report, no one has suggested that that there were no positive things done by these men. In fact, the task force report went to great lengths to explain a balanced record. All of these task force have called for the permanent installation of the exhibit A Campus Divided and other forms of memorialization. So that to suggest that was not what the task force wanted was peculiar. I was deeply puzzled by the regents who said, we have to keep the buildings with these names because otherwise it's erasing history. That is exactly what the task force responded to. In fact, the task force said that Kaufman's name should stay up in its original form, but that it should take another name at this point. But more to the point, the question of General College is especially an interesting one because President Kaufman wanted to open education broadly to the children of immigrants and workers. And a report was, he empowered a committee of 7 to look into liberalizing education, meaning given greater access. Mm-hmm. That group of 7 wrote a report to him that included the materials from the census of 1920. And they included every group, but they left out African Americans. There were more African Americans in the state than the category called other. There were more African Americans in the state than the category referred to as some smaller ethnic groups. But they left out African Americans. Now, again, I'm not saying Kaufman did it. I'm saying the Committee of Seven that was very important to the creation of the General College and the liberalization of the state literally left out a significant minority group because they were unable to understand that African Americans had a place in the state of Minnesota. So the foundation of the liberalizing General College, which of course no longer exists, the foundation of that openness to education never envisioned African Americans. African Americans were allowed to enroll, absolutely. The history of how that happened, I don't think anyone has written. Jewish students, of course, could come here. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't tremendous limits on their experience of Minnesota. And I would say in addition to that, which is something I really hope you'll include in whatever comes out in our podcast, is that the Regents who are trying to rewrite the history of racism and anti-Semitism on this campus are not interested in what the experience of not only those students were, but the communities were. And that was why John Wright had to speak, because John Wright had to tell the story of how the community viewed it. And I could tell you the same thing about the Jewish community. One of the regents who challenged who Samuel Shiner was and whether there was a Jewish Community Relations Council in 1938 challenged the story of the young Jewish woman who left the dental hygiene program because she was told by the head of that program that there were no jobs and that she could stay, her other classmates could stay, but they would never find a job. Regent Rocha insists there is no anti-Semitism in this story because they weren't told to leave. Regent Rocha clearly is unaware that, again, in the files, under Jew, you will see that the head of the dental school was outraged that so many people in the Jewish community called to complain that these daughters of the Jewish community were asked to leave. Can we really best judge the experience of racism and anti-Semitism on the campus of the University of Minnesota by a regent reading a document and saying what it means? Do we look at what the experience of these communities were, what they felt like, what they felt like, what their injury was? I have given now to the president 2 families who are in a campus divided exhibit who are willing to talk to him about their experiences. Now, they didn't know about what their parents were doing when they were sophomores in college. I wonder how many people, how many progeny of people know. And so I had the extraordinary honor of telling them about their father's courage in fighting for integration, fighting against repression. And they had stories, very brief ones, that their parents had actually told them about anti-Semitism on the campus. It is amazing that in 2019, we are hearing from the people who are the stewards of the University of Minnesota, the regents, chosen by the legislature as public servants who look over and look for what is best for the University of Minnesota, lecturing African Americans and Jews about what their experience was in the 1930s.
And in watching, my only experience with the Board of Regents was watching that meeting. The Board of Regents chosen by the legislature of the state of Minnesota, frankly, look nothing like the state of Minnesota.
That is correct.
And we're going to leave it at that. I did want to ask, though, they seemed open to the idea of just because they're voting it down now doesn't mean the conversation is done, doesn't mean things couldn't change. How hopeful are you that anything could be different?
Well, they did put that in writing. They did put it in the resolution.
Mm-hmm.
And they said that this would be worked out with the incoming president, President-to-be, Joan Gable. We have no idea what that means or what that looks like. We have no idea how that will unfold. That's a complete uncertainty. What we do know is that there are 3 regents who are continuing to state repeatedly that all of the work of the task force and this exhibition is full of distortions, untruths, and lies. And these men will not put into writing their accusations to allow the scholars to respond. On Facebook, if you happen to use Facebook, someone at the University of Minnesota posted a portion of what you saw in the live stream. In my colleague, Regents Professor Elaine Tyler May, calling of all radical things to listen to scholars, and a small portion of the 17 minutes of John Wright's testimony, which was
exquisite,
which was preceded by the threat to have him removed by the police. When I looked yesterday, that little video has been viewed by over 11,000 people. That, I guess you could call that going viral. 11,000 people, including former students, PhD students of ours who are now full professors in other universities, saying, these were my teachers speaking. My teacher created a campus divided. Over 11,000 people have had an opportunity to hear the chair of the Board of that Board of Regents meeting threaten to remove Professor John Wright because some of us asked, shouted, demanded that he respond to a particular statement from Regent Beeson. Other than segregated housing, Regent Beeson said, African American students face no barriers at the University of Minnesota. And we demanded, amazingly, that an African American distinguished scholar have the opportunity to describe what the experience of being an African American student was like through the eyes of his aunt, his father, and the black press of the period.
Well, Professor Riv-Ellen Prell, thank you for joining us. Can we end on a light note? Is that okay?
Of course.
All right, so we always end our Who the Folks with these same 2 questions.
Okay.
Favorite Jewish food?
My favorite Jewish.
I know it's a complete 180 from the gravity of what we've just talked about.
Our family's matzo ball soup.
Okay.
Vegetarian matzo ball soup.
Okay.
Yes.
And this is a passed down recipe? No. Okay.
From me to my children.
Okay. Excellent. And favorite Jewish holiday?
You know, I love them all.
Okay.
I love them all.
All right. Well, Professor Riv-Ellen Prell, thank you for joining us, and we appreciate the history lesson, especially in the wake of everything that went down at the university last week, and we'll keep a close eye on what goes on from here.
Thank you. Let me give a shout-out to TC Jewfolk. Oh. It's a fantastic digital presence in our state, in the Twin Cities. You all are doing great work. We are a better place since you all came along.
Well, I am blushing now. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Riv-Ellen Prell for joining us this week on the podcast. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere else you can find podcasts these days. If you have a suggestion for somebody who would be a great guest on the pod, please email me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. Thank you again for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week.